Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the people who have been coming regularly, and welcome to people who are new today. How many of you are new today? Okay, very good. Then you'll have a lot of fun with my talk, because I tend to be an old professor and I talk about very esoteric things. So hopefully try to make it understandable today. We've been going through a series of talks on the disciples of the Buddha. So usually when people practice Buddhism and they become introduced to it, they learn about the life of the Buddha, how he came from a wealthy family, how he was very concerned about how it was that there was suffering in the world. He wanted to understand that suffering and help people to stop suffering. So he practiced as an ascetic for 6 years with a group of 5 good companions, and then he eventually left them and made a great effort to become enlightened, sitting under the Bodhi tree and other trees in Bodh Gaya, and having his awakening, and then making a decision to teach. So people learn the story of the Buddha and they're impressed by that, and they say, oh, this Buddhism is something that I can practice, and I can learn how to decrease my suffering. If I can't become enlightened, maybe I can become enlightened, but more likely I'm going to maybe learn techniques where I can decrease my suffering and decrease the suffering of others who I care about, others in the world, even people who are difficult. Maybe I can help decrease their suffering. So this motivation inspires people to begin to practice the path of the Dharma, and as it does now, also during the Buddha's time. Of course, there were many people who were very inspired to learn how to do this practice, how to become enlightened themselves, and having the opportunity of actually having a Buddha with them, they made very good progress. So these disciples of the Buddha, these are the people that we're studying, learning a little bit about during this period of time. So we've learned a little bit about some of the major disciples of the Buddha, Sariputra, Mahamoggallana, Mahakassapa, Ananda. We've been hearing about their lives, and today I'm going to talk about another of the disciples of the Buddha named Anuruda. And his particular skill and talent, as we'll see, is he has 2 particular talents. One is called the ability to be able to see with what's called the divine eye, and also as an expert in interpreting and helping people know how to practice satipatthana, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness. This is a particular practice that is very close to our practice here at Maba. We really emphasize the practice of the foundations of mindfulness, and when you come to retreats here at Maba, you are instructed and learn about how to practice these. So to learn a little bit about Anuruda, he came from a very wealthy family. So wealthy that he was never told there isn't any. So whenever he needed something, they would never say, oh no, there isn't any. So I like these legends very much. They're very enjoyable. There was a story where he was playing marbles with a group of his friends, and he kept losing. And he was gambling, and when he lost, he had to give them little cakes. And so he would send a messenger back to the kitchen to his mother and say, I need some more cakes. So apparently he was losing at marbles so much that they ran out of cakes. So his mother sent back a message, there isn't any. But he had never heard this phrase before, so he thought that this meant that there was a special cake called there isn't any. So he said, oh, that's fine, just send me some of those. So she sent back an empty plate. But as the legend has it, the devas, the celestial beings, didn't want Anuruda to be disappointed, so they put special celestial cakes on the plate. So he brought them back, and the children liked those. He said, "Oh, there isn't any cakes. This is the best cake of all." He had a brother who. When the Buddha came to visit, Anuruda is actually a cousin of the Buddha. He has the same mother as Ananda. So his brother was very taken by the Buddha's teaching and also inspired Anuruda to go and listen to the Buddha, and there was a decision made that one of the brothers should go into the Buddhist monastic life to become homeless. But Anuruda was hesitant about this at first because he came from a wealthy family, and he thought, well, going into the homeless life, that must be very difficult. And then his brother said to him, being a wealthy person, you have to be concerned about how the fields are tilled, how the animals are cared for, how you maintain the palace and everything. There are a lot of things that you have to do. Anuruda said, well, when are those things over? He said, oh no, they're never over. During your whole life, you'll have to struggle with that. So Anuruda thought to himself, well, maybe better to go into the homeless life. I'm not quite sure if he was doing it out of laziness at that point. But so he went to his mother and said, oh, I think I want to go in to follow the Buddha. And the mother said, oh no, I don't think that this is such a good idea, but if your other cousin, who's a prince, if he goes, then you can go too. So he went to his other cousin and eventually convinced him that they should go together into the homeless life. And so altogether there were 5 of them, along with Anuruda, who went to see the Buddha to become a monastic. And one of the people who went with them to kind of carry their goods while they were traveling was their barber. His name was Upali. So they took leave of Upali, and then they went on their way, leaving all of their fine clothing and everything with Upali because they didn't want to see the Buddha in their fine clothes. But Upali thought to himself, well, since they're going into the homeless life, maybe I should join them. So he turned around and joined them. Upali becomes very important later in the story because he is the person who ends up memorizing the code of conduct, which of course is passed on from generation to generation and called the Vinaya. So when Anuruda began to practice, he had a particular talent to be able to transcend what's called the physical eye. He was able to see into the nature of things using what was called the divine eye, being able to see beyond the range of the physical eye, extending to a 1,000-fold world system. And so he was able to transcend much of what was going on physically and be able to see into its true nature. So even though he had not yet become an arahant, he was not enlightened, he still had gained this particular facility, this power. So this is part of a teaching called the 5 eyes. So if you're not familiar with this, I'll explain it to you a little bit. We have a flesh eye, or an earthly eye. And this eye actually, on a scientific level, is attuned to visible light. But we know that visible light is just a small part of the spectrum of light. One of the metaphors that I heard is that the visible light would be like the width of a dime, and the rest of light would go from New York to California. So there's a lot of light spectrum that we can't see. So a person with this divine eye is able to have an understanding, being able to see into the nature of things beyond visible light. The third eye is called the wisdom eye, the fourth called the Dharma eye, and the fifth called the Buddha eye. So this is a talk in and of itself, but I'm going to just mention this and then move on to an understanding of this divine vision, where a person who has this can see other realms, not just this realm in which we live, and can see into the past and future from inside and outside, and has a knowledge of what happens when we pass away and when rebirth occurs. So this is part of the divine eye ability. So one of the things that I like Anuruda very much, and the reason that I think I like him so much is because he struggled with meditation. And it was difficult for him to make progress in meditation. So to become an arahat was not easy for him. And the Buddha would often visit and ask him about his progress, and he would explain his difficulties in meditation, and that he kept being distracted by his divine eye, that he was able to have this radiance and inner light when he would practice. And the Buddha also discussed how when he was also doing meditation before he became enlightened, he too had these kinds of difficulties, and the Buddha would give him suggestions as to how to overcome these difficulties, which he called the 11 imperfections. So there's a big teaching on the 11 imperfections. Again, that's a talk in and of itself. So just to expose you to the notion that these difficulties, when a person begins to enter into these states of higher concentration, you can become very distracted by them and get stuck. This is very lovely. I'm seeing this radiance. I must be very close to enlightenment, but in fact, it can be just a distraction. So the Buddha explained to Anuruda about his own experience about this radiant light, and which is called Opasa. And there's some confusion about when a person experiences this. In some of the notes, they say about how it may occur when a person has an awareness at the first jhana, or it can happen when a person is entering the fourth jhana. But in fact, there are some clarifications that I had to study here, and it actually is associated with the fourth dharma, the fourth jhana. So for those people who are familiar with the higher levels of concentration, the first level of concentration that a person enters into after a good amount of their practice, they're able to begin to experience a thought from the beginning of the thought all the way through to the end without any interruption. And then eventually that speech thought process in the mind stops in the second jhana, and at that point the person enters into a state where their mind is absorbed in joyfulness. And in the third jhana, it's the joyfulness even dissolves, and the person experiences just a profound tranquility. And then when they enter into the fourth jhana, the mind is just one-pointed. So these different stages, these first 4 jhanas, there are 4 more after that. The mind becomes so rarefied in its thinking, so subtle, that this is where this emergence of this radiant light takes place. And apparently Anuruddha had a particular way of being able to penetrate to this level and experience this. But it got him stuck. So he needed help to move beyond that. So eventually he was really very close to becoming an arahat, and he still continued to be stuck. And the Buddha came to him and gave him a final instruction to help him. Anuruddha was having 7 different awarenesses, and he explained those to the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Oh, that's wonderful. These are correct awarenesses, but you need one more." And the Buddha gave him this final awareness, and as soon as he heard it, that's what helped him become enlightened. So the instruction that the Buddha gave, I should mention it to you so we can all get enlightened together at this moment. That would be very nice. So he said, the Dhamma, the teaching, is for one who is inclined to, the word here is papancha, which is the proliferation of storylines of thinking. So this Dhamma is inclined for people who are not going to get caught up in storylines, who delight in not having storylines, not for one who is inclined to worldly storylines and delighting in it. So as soon as Anuruddha heard this, he said, yes, I can now let that go. And he wrote a little poem about this. He said, when the intention arose in me, he, that's the Buddha, gave me further teaching. And the Buddha, who delights in the non-diffusion, the non-storylines, gave me instruction on the non-storylines, the non-diffusion. So once he became an arahat, enlightened person, he devoted his time then to teaching some of his students about how to attain the divine eye, but more inclined to teach people how to practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So I should say something about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. When we practice here together, many of us who have studied with the Master, with the Venerables, we know about Satipatthana, about how to enter the mind into being able to focus first on the body, to go through the entire body and to remain focused there without distraction, or with little distraction, or with a lot of distraction, but being able to bring ourselves back from the distraction, so that the mind is able to go through the entire body, part by part, the outside of the body and the inside of the body. For those people, I like to just mention that for those people who are have become familiar with what's called MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, this is based on the Buddha's teaching of going through the body part by part. But in the Buddha's teaching, we also go into the internal organs. not just the outside. And being familiar with the internal organs takes a bit of practice, but very valuable practice, so that the person can really learn to distinguish what is going on in the internal organs, how to pay attention to the more subtle levels of what's going on in our body. And this leads into what's called the second of the four foundations, what's called mindfulness of feeling. So when a person becomes mindful of feeling, they notice, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, this is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and they learn how to attend to the feeling without becoming attached to it. So they can feel a feeling, but they don't have to become the feeling, they don't have to become attached to that feeling. So they just notice it, observe it, accept it, let it go. And they're able to transform feelings also. So certain feelings that are troublesome, they learn how to transform them into feelings of loving kindness and compassion, etc. So the third of the four foundations is called mindfulness of mind. Now this is a very difficult subject because the Buddha does not give a lot of explanation about it. It is just kind of set out, and there it is in front of you, and you have to kind of figure it out, and it takes quite a bit of practice and contemplation to understand mindfulness of mind. So many people had trouble with this third foundation of mindfulness. And one such person was the main carpenter at Savatthi. So his name was Panchakanga. So, we here at Maba, we have these buildings didn't just sprout up from the earth. Well, people had to build them. We had lots of carpenters helping us here to build this. So Savatthi was the first retreat center of the Buddha, so someone had to build it. So one of the main builders, his name was Panchakanda, but he also was someone who was very interested in the Dharma. Just not a builder, but he also wanted to learn. So he was confused about mindfulness of mind, particularly one part of mindfulness of mind was very confusing for him. And he asked Anuruda a question about it. So this has to do with the fifth of the 8 parts of mindfulness of mind. Let me see if I can make a little sense out of this. The first 3 are not particularly difficult. We examine the mind and say, is my mind full of desire and greediness and sensual lust? Is my mind wanting a lot of those things, or is my mind not so involved in that? So we examine the mind in that way. The second is my mind an angry mind? Does it have hate in it? Is it something that leads me to become angry with my words or behaviors or thoughts? Or is my mind free from that? The third examination of the mind has to do with, is my mind confused a lot? Does it attach to things in a personal way, where when things happen, I always take it personally? Am I deluded by having this self that's so ego, so important? Those are the first three. Or is my mind free from that? So these are important things that we contemplate in the mind. The fourth is a little bit more controversial. I don't want to get into it today, but it in the original Pali text, it refers to the mind being too loose or too tight, restless or sleepy. Which makes sense. This is very much connected with what we later learn about in the fourth foundation about the hindrances. But in the Chinese system, it doesn't make sense because all of the 8 different parts are divided. Each one has a kind of a good quality and one where the mind is stuck. But in this one, both parts would be a place where the mind would be stuck. So when it gets translated into the Chinese, they use a different term and they talk about how the mind can be unified. Is the mind scattered or too loose or too tight on one side, and then on the other side, is the mind unified, in balance? Now when we get to the fifth one, as you can see, each one is a little bit more difficult to understand. That's where Panchakanda had his question. So he asked, about this practice called Mahagata. So he said, what is Mahagata? This means a higher level practice. So we can look at it from that point of view. And the carpenter wanted to know, is this the practice, because it's a higher level practice, measureless practice? There's another teaching about the 4 divine abodes, higher level practice. And if anyone would know about this, it would be the person who had developed the divine eye. So this is the practice of what's called Brahma Vihara, where a person cultivates loving kindness and compassion, altruistic joy and equanimity. So the carpenters wanted to know, is this Mahagata, is that the practice? And Anuruda gave an expert opinion. He said, no, this is not the case. My teaching is that Mahagata is actually something different than loving kindness and compassion. It has to do with the ability of the mind to be able to look at things from a very wide perspective, so that the inner perception becomes wider and wider and becomes unlimited, like a vast ocean. And so then the carpenter asked for instruction as to how to develop this, and Anuruda gave him some instructions as to how to do that. And all of this is explained in one of the suttas called Majjhima Nikaya 127. So, certainly practicing of loving kindness and compassion is very important, but when we talk about this level of expanding the mind, being able to see things in a vast way, that's what this practice, called the superior practice, is about. So, Anuruda also is important at the very end of the Buddha's life. At that time, Sariputra and Mahamoggallana had already passed away. So Ananda and Mahakassapa and Anuruda were present at the, I think, Mahakassapa was there as well. I know Ananda was there. But they were observing the Buddha as he was going through his stages of practice before he passed away. And at one point, Ananda announced to the group that the Buddha had passed. But in fact, it was Anuruda who said, no, the Buddha has not yet passed. He has entered into one of the higher states of concentration called cessation of perception and feeling. And indeed, Anuruddha was correct, because it was at that time that the Buddha returned to speaking to the group and pronounced his last sentence, Sabe Sankara Anatta Anicca, which means all conditioned things are impermanent. Go forth and practice well. This last line. So at that point, many of the monks who had not yet become enlightened started to grieve and cry, and Anuruddha said, no, not necessary. The Buddha was not going to be here forever. Everything is subject to decay. So please, just observe this wonderful moment and be assured that as you continue to practice, you too will enter into nirvana. So he encouraged them not to grieve. And at the first council that was convened, Anuruddha was entrusted with the preservation of the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the set of verses that are numbered. So there are teachings that contain the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, etc. This forms an entire text, and Anuruddha was the one who committed this to his memory and passed it on until eventually it was written down many years later. So we don't have any real information about the death of Anuruddha, except that there's a stanza that was written about his passing in a particular village below a thicket of bamboo trees, and without any further obstructions, he passed into nirvana when his life force was spent. So this is a little bit of the story of Anuruddha. We should take courage in the fact and that he struggled very, very much with the practice of meditation. It was not easy for him, and even though he had attained certain abilities, sometimes those abilities got in the way of his own practice, and something to be aware of in our own practice, to be encouraged that if others like Anuruddha had a difficult time with meditation, it's okay for us too. We can persist and eventually make very good progress. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the sacred joy, which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity, which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And may our awareness spread far and wide so that we can experience this great nibbana without distraction. Thank you all very much.